3 years after the death of Audrey Phillips's husband, Glyndwyr, she discovered something very unexpected. Her husband had kept a big secret from her for over 60 years. In an instant, she learned something about her husband that sounded nothing like him, and she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Audrey was cleaning out her husband's office when she came across his drawer. He had passed away 3 years ago, but she had just now scrambled up the courage to go into his private room. He had always asked her to never come into this room, but she had no other choice now. As she looked through the drawer, Audrey noticed strange documents. They didn't look like they belonged to her husband, not at first glance, at least. But when she kept reading, she put two and two together. More questions filled her head as she suddenly realized her husband could have been lying to her. Audrey's heart sank as she thought of her husband being untrue, but she didn't want to believe everything immediately. Little did she know she was about to uncover more and more information. But what was her husband lying about? What did Audrey find in the drawer? And how will she uncover the truth? But before we start, smash the like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our upcoming stories. Audrey had always adored her husband and considered him the sweetest and most honest man on earth. They lived a humble life with not a lot of money to their name, but recently it turned out that he hadn't told Audrey the whole truth about his past. Their incredible story began at the local bar where they met over 60 years ago. They were both young adults at that time, and from the moment they looked each other in the eyes, it was love at first sight. When Glyn first approached Audrey, she felt he had something mysterious about him. But she also felt comfortable with him very quickly. She loved the way that Glyn looked at her with his beautiful blue eyes. And more importantly, she immediately felt very safe when she was with him. Audrey and Glyn were both more in love than they had ever been. Together they went on dates, exploring the town, and sometimes quietly sneaking away to have a rendezvous. Life with Glyn was exciting for Audrey, but most importantly, it was stable. Although Glyn had a habit of disappearing for his hobby, she was never left feeling alone or unloved. Audrey and Glyn fell in love more and more, and eventually the happy cute couple got married. They were each other's soulmates during their whole life, and Audrey thought she knew her husband like no one else. After a few months, the doctor gave them the news that changed their lives. It started with a soft pain, and suddenly Audrey found herself at the doctor's office. Both she and Glyn were newly married and enjoying their time together. In fact, Glyn had just returned from one of his mysterious trips when the accident happened. The doctor looked at both of them and sighed. He had some important news, and little did they know that it would change their lives. The doctor told Audrey and Glyn that they were expecting a baby. So after another couple of months, they welcomed their son Jake into the world. They lived a very happy life, although Glyn often had to work very long days, while Audrey never really knew what he was doing. Glyn was a family man, and although Glyn would sometimes head out on his mysterious trips, Audrey never doubted his love. He was an attentive father and a dedicated husband. Audrey would often catch herself imagining what exactly his work and hobby trips involved, but soon Glyn would be home as usual and helping to care for their son. Glyn and Audrey soon faced their first conflict. One day, Glyn headed out for a walk. It wasn't unusual for him to do so, and so Audrey didn't think much of it. But when he returned, he looked frazzled and worried. He insisted that he and Audrey would have to move to a different location and soon. He said they would have to leave in less than a week. Audrey was confused and hurt. She didn't want to move. Everyone she knew and loved lived in their town. Plus, Glyn's behavior worried her. She stayed up sleeplessly, wondering what he had seen or heard to cause him to freak out in such a way. In the midst of the conflict came a new pressing issue that neither Glyn nor Audrey had seen coming. It all happened one evening. Audrey was standing in the doorway trying to explain to Glyn that leaving their town would be a mistake when she felt a piercing pain. Audrey was pregnant for a second time, and this time, they were expecting a gorgeous baby girl. Due to complications and lack of medical advancement, having the baby would mean that the young couple would need to prepare for the likelihood of never having children again. Audrey and Glyn chose to have the baby, but that meant putting off the move for now. Since Audrey's pregnancy was high risk, travel was not an option. Audrey could tell that Glyn was disappointed and worried about not being able to leave, but he turned his focus to something else. Glyn turned his focus to his young family. He took care of their son in the months that Audrey was bedridden and cared for them all. Audrey even noticed that the trips seemed to have reduced. And one day, to Audrey's surprise, Glyn had very important news to pass on to her. Glyn had a change of heart and no longer wanted their family to move. His reason, having 2 children and helping Audrey, showed him that it wasn't easy raising children and that they would need all the support they could get. Audrey found his reason questionable but chose not to talk about it. But soon their world would be shaken by some troubling signs. Glyn and Audrey lived happily together, raising their children and sharing their devotion of love to one another. So happy that 50 years went like a breeze for the couple. However, another big change in their lives came. Glyn's health started getting worse. After Glyn suffered trembling hands and problems with moving, he went to a doctor who brought him the news that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. It broke Audrey's heart hearing that her husband had Parkinson's disease. She wanted to make the most of the time they still had together. Glyndwyr's health deteriorated rapidly. He knew that his life would soon come to an end. So would he finally come clean and tell his wife about his secret? He didn't, and he died in 2015 from the impact of this disease. Many people who loved him were sadly left behind by his death. He was known to his loved ones as a loving family man who worked almost his entire life as a civil engineer. Since Audrey and Glyn were each other's soulmates and had been together for more than 60 years, Audrey had a very difficult time after the death of her husband. She had a lot of trouble dealing with his death, but she had no idea that it would only get harder after she discovered his secret. Because Audrey was having so much trouble dealing with the death of her husband, Glyn, she couldn't get it over her head to clean up his belongings. Even his clothes still hung in the exact same place in the closet as before his death. Eventually, 3 years after his death, she gathered the courage to clean up his belongings. It was very emotional for Audrey because while cleaning up, all the memories that she made together with her lovely husband came up. Even though it was hard for her, she had cleaned up almost everything. It was Glyn's personal drawer that was standing in his office for all those years. Besides his work as a civil engineer, Glyn had a passion for writing. He often retreated to his office and then wrote poems and novels to clear his head. Although they had been together for more than 60 years, she never had a look into this drawer. The two shared everything and knew everything about each other. When she opened the drawer and went through the papers, she came across some strange documents that aroused her curiosity. They were old documents that Glyn had never told her about. And the strangest thing was that they contained a different name. One of the documents she found showed the results of a memory test. The results showed that the boy who had taken the test had an exceptionally good memory, especially in the area of remembering pictures and maps, a so-called photographic memory. Shortly after, she found another remarkable document in the drawer. It was a letter with a statement that the decision was taken to pull the boy out of school. The letter was from the year 1944, and the reason that was given for this rigorous decision was his photographic memory. Audrey realized that the boy only was 13 years old at that time, exactly the same age as her husband Glyn was in 1944. At first, she thought it belonged to a school friend of Glyn, but later on she became suspicious. She considered it illogical that a boy should have to leave school because of his good memory. She continued her search for new information in the documents to find out exactly what was going on and who the boy was. When she had almost reached the bottom of the pile of papers, she came across a document that was even stranger than anything she had seen that day. The document was about a secret operation called XX and a counter-espionage project. She still couldn't place it, and she had no idea what this had to do with her husband. Then she saw a little note with a telephone number. She knew the phone number was a lead that she had desperately hoped for, but she was nervous to get the truth. Would it shatter her good thoughts of Glyn, or would it make her love her late husband more? Audrey thought about it for days, and it soon began to consume her waking hours. For so long, she had debated on what the strange hobby was, and why Glyn had never offered up an answer. She even wondered if he would be upset or proud of her for searching for the truth. Audrey decided to call the number she found on a little note in Glyndwyr's drawer. She called twice, but nobody answered. Later that night, she sat in her chair and suddenly the phone rang. Audrey answered the phone and she heard a dark, calm voice asking, "Yes, I found your number between some documents from my husband. I don't understand. Maybe you can help me out." "Let's meet tomorrow," the man answered. "I will explain everything." The next day, a very old man arrived at Audrey's house. After they grabbed a cup of tea, they sat down and the man started talking. "Audrey, I have worked with your husband for over 30 years, and there is something he never told you. Glyn wasn't the man you thought he was." He continued, "Glyndwyr was a very talented man. He was incredibly smart, which was discovered at a very young age. You know, the times were troubling and there was a lot of tension in the world. Both he and I were recruited by the army to be trained. We were selected for a special program. Only our fathers were allowed to know of this, and we had to keep it secret for everybody we ever met, including you, obviously. We went through all sorts of training programs. We were taught German and had to do memory tests. We were young and normal school was boring, so obviously we wanted to enter this adventure. Although we never really knew back then what kind of tasks we had to do and how our lives would look like. We almost completed our training, and then the Second World War started. Glyndwyr and I were just 14 years old when we got our first mission. We had to crawl through dirty, long concrete pipes to secretly enter prisons. There we would try to talk to German prisoners of war to try and win their trust. We did this for a few years until the war ended. But after the war, Glyndwyr and I kept in contact with our captain. We had to do more training, and we were never allowed to speak of anything we did. We were trained to lead a double life. We had to find a partner and create a fake identity, so it would appear to the outside world that we had normal lives. But in the meantime, we would take part in secret intelligence missions, however, Don't imagine we were like James Bond. Our first mission was to help capture 2 spies. We were paid Ps 20 if we completed the mission. We had to break into an army camp, keeping an eye on the suspects and making sure these were the right guys, after which we had to report their whereabouts so they could be captured. Some missions were getting very dangerous. One time Glyndwyr had to extract a fellow spy from a boat to pick up a load of arms. He had to take out the searchlight on one of the 2 gunboats and make sure he nor the other spy was captured. Remember how he was away for a football weekend 3 weeks after you were married? Well, he had to come up with a clever excuse because he came back with big bruises and he was completely sore, so the football weekend lie worked. But he was actually working the secret mission during that weekend. Audrey was completely in shock and couldn't believe that she hadn't suspected or discovered anything at all in all these years of marriage. She was left behind with so many questions, but it looked like she would never have the answers. The note contained another secret which again took her completely by surprise. But luckily, she was surprised in a positive way this time. Her husband had left a handwritten note, especially for his wife. When Audrey read the bill, her mouth fell open and she was even more in shock. The letter started with Glyndwyr saying, "Dear Audrey, if you ever read this, then you've discovered my biggest secret. I hope you understand I could never tell you what I did. I did it to keep you safe." The letter also stated that Audrey had a big surprise waiting for her. Lynn had left her a huge check for the money he had earned as a spy. They always lived a sober but happy life, and it turned out that Glyn had always saved the money he had earned as a spy for when the time would come that he was no longer there. Aubrey's doing great now. The money was put towards the veterans' relief as she was proud of her husband and those like him for doing their best in those situations. She often tells her grandchildren of Glyn and the secret life of courage he lived, and together the family is doing well honoring Glyn's memory. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another unbelievable tale like this one.